So now that we talked about macronutrients and micronutrients and the importance of quality over quantity when it comes to nutrition, in this module, we're going to talk about nutrient insufficiencies and excesses. We're going to start with talking about state of the state when it comes to our diet. The Standard American Diet, or the acronym which I love, SAD, and the health consequences that come along with it. And we're going to look at the most common nutrient insufficiencies or deficiencies, looking at the function in our body, the symptoms that might pose, and what sources we can find in our diet. And then we'll end with practical takeaways. So what's the state of our American diet? We are overeating, yet malnourished. Seems ironic, but we are eating too many calories for our body to process, but we're not getting the proper nutrients in. And there's been a dramatic change in our diet since World War II. We used to eat food shortly after harvest and seasonally. Plus, eating meat was on an occasional basis and it was always wild. Today, we have so many new strains of crops, from wheat to soy to corn. We're putting genetically modified organisms on them to keep the pests away and to grow larger yields. This chemical usage on our fields has shown, we have seen like graphs of the high correlation with the amount of chemicals that we're using over the years and our rates of obesity, as well as type 2 diabetes, even cancers. Our dairy cows are injected with hormones. Our commercial feedlot animals are fed antibiotics, heavy metals, and hormones. We've got artificial preservatives, colorings, flavorings, sweeteners inundating our food supply. I like to fondly call them frankenfoods. So what is the Standard American Diet, SAD, composing of and not composing of? We are getting way too much of the foods that will outlive us. So the processed packaged foods, artificial ingredients. You turn over that ingredient list and you cannot identify half of the ingredients that are in that list. Refined processed grains, sugar, salt, trans and saturated fats, alcohol. What are we not getting enough of? Whole natural foods, fresh vegetables and fruits. In fact, recent study has confirmed that we're on average getting 1 fruit and 1.5 vegetable a day. Now, you might still remember the recommendation of get 5 a day. That's way in the past. Today, for optimal living and health and vibrancy, and cancer risk reduction, we need 9 to 11 servings a day. So you can see we're far from that recommendation. Healthy fats and oils, quality proteins, and fiber. So what are the health consequences of this diet? We're seeing higher blood sugars, A1C levels, hemoglobin A1C levels. That's what I call a 3-month lie detector test. What has our blood sugar been doing over the last 3 months? And LDL, or lousy cholesterol levels. This is all creating systemic inflammation in our body. And why? Is the circulating sugars combine with our proteins and fats, and they create damaging compounds that are called AGEs, advanced glycation end products. And that is exactly what they're doing, is they're aging us fast. These bind to receptors called RAGEs. And these RAGE-AGE complexes activate multiple inflammatory genes. So guess what? Inflammation goes up. We already talked about what that does in our body. And then our mitochondria, our energy powerhouses. When we're eating the Standard American Diet, we're getting a lot of toxins and chemicals which are going to destroy the mitochondria by creating too many free radicals, and we don't have enough of the phytonutrients and antioxidants coming in from our fruits and vegetables to neutralize that. These free radicals stimulate the inflammatory response and we get cell death. So what are the most common nutrient insufficiencies? Vitamin D, iron, B12, iodine, calcium, and magnesium. Let's start with vitamin D. When you get a blood test, that blood test range can be anywhere from 30 to 100 nanograms per milliliter. So if you fall anywhere in that range, your doc's going to say, A-okay. What we know now is that optimal is going to be between 50 and 80 nanograms per milliliter. And the reason why we want that tighter range is for these many functions that vitamin D plays in the body. Vitamin D is a critical nutrient. It actually acts as a pro-hormone in the body. And it has all of these important functions such as immune support, inflammation support. It stimulates our gene expression by turning the genes up or down, on or off. Mineralizes our bones, it keeps our bones strong, supports our mood. It also increases our cell receptivity to glucose and insulin, so less insulin resistance. What are the signs of deficiency? It tends to be more prevalent in the elderly and dark-skinned individuals, and it really is hard to detect. Oftentimes it's going to be more by bone loss. So you'd have to have a DEXA scan to see what your bone density is. Maybe you have increased fractures. You keep breaking or fracturing bones, or your muscle or joint pain, decreased immunity, depressed mood, or poor wound healing, or other signs or symptoms. Where do we get vitamin D? The best source is the sun. The sun is, our sunshine is our vitamin D. And this is going to be important because today, if you think about our current culture, we're either inside more than we're outside. And if we're outside, we're completely covered with clothing or sunscreen. So we're frightened of skin cancer. And so we're not getting the sun one way or the other. And even like for me living in the upper Midwest, we have a very small window within the year where the sun is actually strong enough to even get that vitamin D activated in our skin. So sensible sun exposure, try to avoid those peak hours, especially in the heat of the day, but you want to get enough sun exposure to large parts of your body without sunscreen on until you just start turning pink. And so that's why you can see why dark-skinned individuals are higher risk of deficiency, because it's going to take them a lot longer time to get that slight pinkness to their skin by being out in the sun. So again, wait until your skin starts to turn just slightly pink, then apply the sunscreen or the clothing and prevent the burning. We don't want to burn, we want to get just a little pink to get that vitamin D activated in the skin. Other sources would be fatty fish and supplementation. So in regards to supplementation, most Americans, I'll be honest, are going to benefit from supplementation. And that is making sure that it's vitamin D3, and it also comes with K2. So K2 is going to be key in regards to keeping that vitamin D in the bones and enhancing that absorption. One thing to know is that if you're prescribed a vitamin D because your levels are low and your doctor recommends a prescription, that is typically a vitamin vitamin D2, and that's not going to be the same active vitamin D that your body can use within. So make sure that you are taking vitamin D3 with K2 included. Iron. When you're testing iron, you can test iron. There's a whole iron panel that you can do with binding capacity and iron saturation, also ferritin. Ferritin is going to be a better indicator than iron. Iron is an acute phase reactant, so that might be more reflective to inflammation in the body, and where that inflammation is coming, we're not really sure. Ferritin, again, the range that you're optimally wanting to strive for would be 40 to 80 nanograms per milliliter. Another large lab range. Anything less than 40 is considered insufficient, less than 20 is deficient. And you can, your lab values will go that low, and so you'll still be told you're okay. So what are the functions of iron in the body? It's the main component of red blood cells. So it will bind with hemoglobin to transport oxygen to our cells. And without enough oxygen, our cells will die. So we want to make sure that we have adequate iron in our bodies. Also helps to regulate cell growth and differentiation. So super important during pregnancy and childhood and infancy as we're growing and developing at much higher and rapid rates. Who's most prevalent for deficiency? For that reason, kids, menstruating women because we're losing blood every month, pregnant women, and then also vegetarians and vegans because they're not getting the primary sources of iron in the diet. Signs would be fatigue, weakness, shortness of breath upon exertion. And that tends to be my classic example for folks is, do you, like, especially if you're an athlete and you exercise, you have a regular routine, you do fine during your structured activity, but you walk a flight of stairs and at the top you can't catch your breath and your muscles and your legs are just so fatigued, they're throbbing, they're aching. That's a classic sign of iron deficiency. Pallor, so very pale skin, eyelids, like if you were to lift your eyelid up, nail beds, lips, and low immunity. So where do we get iron in the diet? There's heme and non-heme sources. Your heme sources are coming from animal sources, and those are going to be your best absorbed forms. So you can see why vegetarians and vegans are going to have a harder time, because the non-heme, you can get iron in plant-based foods, but they're not going to be absorbed at the same rate. Now, if you add on vitamin C, that increases the absorption. So you can pair that with some citrus fruit or strawberries or bell peppers, so vitamin C sources in your diet, or possibly a vitamin C supplement just to enhance that iron absorption. Supplementation of iron, not recommended long term. We don't want more. Remember that U curve risk in regards to nutrients. So we don't want to be deficient, but we also don't want to be overdosing. So know that with iron, you may not need it long term. When you do, so a lot of people are afraid to do iron supplementation because then they get constipated or GI distress. And that's because your most traditional form of iron is a sulfate form, and that's really hard on the gut. So if you do need an iron supplementation, go with a bisglycinate form. That won't be affected by your GI, or your GI system will not be affected by that. So much gentler on your GI tract. Another reason why just lower iron levels, and you can also see this in the elderly, is you need enough stomach acid, so hydrochloric acid in your stomach to absorb iron. And so that can be low in the elderly because we're going to naturally decline our hydrochloric acid levels as we age, or if we're taking proton pump inhibitors for long periods of time, that can also affect our iron absorption. Vitamin B12. Now you can see I have methylmalonic acid. You can get B12 tested in the blood. Methylmalonic acid is also tested in the blood, and that is an earlier indicator, and it has an inverse relationship. So if you have a higher methylmalonic acid level, that means your B12 status is low. So that's a better indicator, more functionally used. So what do we need B12 for? It's critical for our nerve cells, DNA and RNA synthesis, red blood cell production. It's an essential nutrient, which means every cell needs it to function, but our body doesn't produce it. So we have to get it from external sources. So how do we know if we're deficient? It's going to be most prevalent in vegetarians, and you're going to find out why in just a moment. So 80 to 90% of vegetarians are low. Also 25% of adults. And this comes back to the same thing as iron. We need an acidic environment in our stomach to help us absorb B12. So if we're older or we're taking a proton pump inhibitor, we're going to have lower hydrochloric acid status, and so we're not going to be absorbing B12 as efficiently as we could. So we might notice anemia. So on blood tests, you might notice your hemoglobin, hematocrit, your red blood cell markers are on the low side, mental fog, poor memory, mood swings, apathy, fatigue, tingling of the extremities, appetite loss, dry, dark, round, or curved nail end beds. So lots of different symptoms. Where do we find it in our diet? In animal foods, organ meats, clams, and oysters, fish, meat, poultry, and dairy are best source of B12 with the best absorption. Your non-animal foods really are going to be your fortified grains, which is taking us back to those processed, refined, and packaged products that have a multitude of ingredients that we can't identify or pronounce. Lots of chemicals, frankenfoods. So supplements may be necessary in certain populations, and you will want to look for a methylated form. So what that means is when you turn over the package of your supplement, you want to look for B12. Does it say methylcobalamin or does it say cyanocobalamin? Methylcobalamin is your methylated version. Many of us have genetic inabilities to methylate within the body. And so that is when we certainly would need a methylated version. Or if our gut isn't functioning well. And what we do know is about 3/4 of the American population does not have functioning guts. So again, better to find that methylcobalamin option when you are supplementing. Some people may need to get an IV infusion so that it bypasses the gut and goes right into the bloodstream. So everybody is different. Some people get shots of B12 once a week. So everyone is different. Best to get tested and work with a practitioner to help guide you on this one. Iodine. So not one that we typically hear about or think about. We've got, like, when you look at the United States, kind of that midline grid is what we call the goiter belt. So where we have very iodine and mineral depleted soils. And when you're testing iodine, it does need to be a urine test, typically a 24-hour urine test. And the reason for that is over 90% of our iodine is excreted through the urine. So blood test, not as accurate. Do a urine test. And why do we need iodine? For our thyroid, as well as for our breast health. When we look at the body, the two areas with the greatest receptors are the thyroid and the breast. So thyroid function, we also know that we have receptors for thyroid all over our body. So even more important than outside of those two organ tissues. And then also low levels have been correlated with higher risk for cancer and fibrocystic breasts and even breast cancer. So what are the signs of deficiency? Goiter, so that's more of an enlarged thyroid gland. Sometimes you can feel that just feels really full. Other times it's your doctor who's palpating it and can tell that it's enlarged. Increased heart rate, shortness of breath, weight gain, dry mouth, so inability to produce enough saliva, dry skin, and lack of sweating. What are our food sources? Seaweed, like kelp. And we want to be careful because some of our seaweed sources are contaminated with heavy metals. So know your source, try to go organic if you can, does not completely dismiss that there's any heavy metal contamination. Fish and seafood as well are high in iodine. So same thing, keep it on the lower fish. We talked about smash fish. We will be talking about smash fish in a future module with the protein. Is the smaller fish are lower in mercury and heavy metals than our larger fish, like a shark or swordfish or mahi-mahi. Supplementation of iodine. There is supplementation available, just there is a risk of taking too much of it because they tend to be in higher potencies. So make sure that you use caution and you work with a practitioner if you find that you are low in iodine or dealing with any of those conditions that are correlated with lower iodine status. What about calcium? In regards to testing for calcium, you will get a blood level of calcium. It's not necessarily a great indicator of your calcium status, more of your vitamin D status and parathyroid status. So DEXA bone density is probably your best indicator of your calcium stores because excess calcium is stored in the bones. And what does calcium do in the body? It mineralizes our bones and our teeth, especially during rapid growth times. It helps our heart, our nerves, and our muscles work properly, more for muscle contraction. So what would we experience if we're low in calcium? If you got a DEXA scan, osteopenia or osteoporosis would be diagnosed. Maybe you've had frequent fractures. If you haven't had a DEXA scan in that case, that's going to be your first stop. Muscle cramps, irritability, acute anxiety, also may be more common in the dairy-free population because one of the best sources of calcium in the diet is dairy or fish with bones. So not just your canned fish, it has to have the bones. That's where the majority of that calcium is. Also oysters, leafy greens, and molasses. Now knowing our plant foods aren't as absorbed as efficiently as your animal sources. And then supplementation. Now this is another one that we have to be cautious with. And a lot of the functional medicine practitioners will actually gear away from supplementing any type of calcium because of the risk of calcification within the arteries. So we want to make sure that we're driving it into the bones, not in the arteries. So do use caution on calcium supplementation. Make sure, again, you're getting tested and you're working with the right practitioner to guide you on what to do in regards to your diet and supplementation. And magnesium. This is our fourth most abundant mineral in the body. If you're testing it, you can do it through blood. Your red blood cell magnesium is the best assessment tool because your magnesium is going to be primarily within that red blood cell. So that would be the way you'd want to test it. What does it do in our body? Magnesium's involved in well over 300 biochemical and enzymatic functions within the body. Bone and teeth structure, smooth muscle relaxation, nervous system function, detoxification, and immunity. So especially when you feel like your muscles are tight because you're under this chronic stress, taking magnesium periodically throughout the day can really support you because it helps the whole nervous system and smooth muscle relax. What are the signs of deficiency? Nearly 80% of Americans are insufficient or deficient. Remember, it's the most common. So like vitamin D is the most common vitamin deficiency. Magnesium, most common mineral deficiency. What might you experience? Abnormal heart rhythm, muscle cramps, restless legs, migraines, fatigue, insulin resistance, high blood pressure, and numbness and tingling in your extremities. Where do we get it? In our colorful plants. Whole grains, wheat bran, wheat germ, oats, nuts, seeds, and legumes, and dark leafy greens. What about supplementation? Again, probably along with vitamin D, magnesium is one of the most supplemented products out there. And there is a myriad of forms for different reasons. So you may want to be aware of that as well. So, magnesium can also help, we talk about detoxification. Certain forms of magnesium can help with the elimination. So how can you help drive that stool to become softer and easier eliminated? That would be more of an oxide or a citrate form, whereas a bisglycinate or glycinate form is going to be your most bioavailable, so your best absorbed form of magnesium for all of the functions that we just mentioned. There's also a threonate form that crosses the blood-brain barrier and helps with cognitive functioning. Also Epsom salt baths. So especially if you're dealing with kind of that restless leg, muscle cramping overnight, taking Epsom salt baths, those are magnesium salts. So that really absorbs through the skin and helps to relax the muscles so that you can hopefully have a calmer and more deep sleep at night. So what are our practical takeaways from this module? Testing. Testing is key. So if you're ever considering supplementation, especially in these common deficiencies, get tested first and get retested. So one thing that I have seen and that is a risk is we get tested once, we take our supplementation and we keep taking our supplementation for years. So we have no idea where we are at that point, and we might be at that high level at this point. So remember, more is not better and longer is not better. So remember to test and retest so you know your levels and you know how to gauge what you should be taking and how long you should be taking it. Increase your intake of foods and nutrients that are commonly low in the diet and that are higher in the nutrients we just discussed today. And supplement as determined beneficial. But with supplementation, key to work with the right health practitioners to guide you. So really taking your whole body into the picture, looking at other medications and supplements that you might be taking. Are there any interactions? What's the best form? How much? When should you take it? So it's not an easy estimation, and we will be talking about supplementation in more depth in a future module. So those are our practical takeaways for today. Hope you learned a lot, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.